All right, let's get right into it. We're going to wind the clock back to the summer of 2020, a really tense time, to look at this group that made a ton of waves by wargaming the presidential election. They were called the Transition Integrity Project, or TIP. Now, they said they were just preparing for chaos, but some of their critics had a very different take. They said TIP wasn't just preparing for a crisis, they were actually writing the playbook for one. So, in this explainer, we're going to unpack what they did, but through a really specific lens: the US military's own playbook for psychological operations. This quote right here from Jennifer Granholm, who was part of the project, it just perfectly captures the mood. And this wasn't some private conversation. She was on CNN, saying this on national television. It really shows that these worst-case scenarios they were gaming out weren't just some academic thought experiment. Nope. They were being floated as very, very real threats. So who exactly was this group? Well, the Transition Integrity Project was a real who's who of over 100 former senior government and campaign leaders, academics, journalists, you name it. Their stated mission sounded pretty noble. Stress test American democracy, right? Find the weak spots in a presidential transition before they break. And this is where the story really splits into. On one hand, TIP presented itself as this bipartisan group trying to safeguard the election. But on the other hand, a completely different story started to emerge. Critics looked at who was involved and what their simulations concluded, and they started saying, hold on a minute, this doesn't feel defensive. This feels offensive, like a plan to shape how people saw the election before a single vote was officially counted. Okay, so to really dig into these claims, we need some kind of framework. And we're not just going to guess. We're going to turn to a pretty wild source: the official U.S. Army Field Manual on Psychological Operations, or PSYOPs. By using the military's own language, their own definitions, we can take a hard look at what TIP was doing and see how well it lines up, or doesn't, with these tactics of influence. So what in the world is a PSYOP? Well, according to the Army's own book, it's all about changing behavior. But you're not using bullets, you're using influence. And you do it by sending selected information to your audience. And that word selected is everything. It's not about the whole truth. It's about crafting a specific narrative to get a specific result. And you don't just shout this message into the wind. No. A PSYOP is precise. It starts with identifying a target audience, or TA. And we're not talking about everybody. We're talking about a very carefully chosen group of people who are in a position to make the changes you want. Everything about the operation is then custom built to influence them. So how do you actually influence that target audience? Well, you use what are called lines of persuasion, or LOPs. Just think of these as your core talking points, the main narrative you want to push. They're the specific themes and messages that are designed to hit home with your target audience and nudge them in the direction you want them to go. All right, so we've got our framework. Let's start applying it. The first question, if we're following the PSYOP playbook, is pretty simple. Who was TIP's audience? When they put out their reports and their scenarios, who were they actually trying to talk to? So let's put on our analyst hats for a second. The very first step in a PSYOP is to nail down your target audience. So who did TIP need to get on their side to achieve their goals? Whether those goals were protecting the election or, as the critics argue, shaping the outcome. Let's break down who they were actually reaching. It really looks like a multi-layered strategy. The main targets? Probably political elites, the people actually in power. And how do you get to them? Through media organizations. You get the media talking, and the elites have to listen. And the ripple effect of all that media coverage, that's what shapes how the general public feels. It's like this top-down cascade of influence designed to set the stage and define what a legitimate election looked like before it was even over. Okay, so if those were the targets, what were the messages? In PSYOP speak, what were the lines of persuasion that the Transition Integrity Project was pushing so hard? One of their greatest hits was this idea of a red mirage. And this quote just nails it. The message was basically, hey, don't be fooled if it looks like Trump is winning on election night. That's just an illusion. Just wait for the mail-in ballots to be counted. This wasn't just a guess. It was an active effort to precondition the public, to frame how they would interpret the results as they rolled in. And this gets us to the messengers. A huge outlet for these narratives seems to have been The Atlantic magazine. And the connections here were, well, they were cozy. A staff writer, David Frum, wasn't just covering TIP, he was in the war games. He was a participant. But when the magazine wrote about the project, that crucial detail, that one of their own was involved, was never disclosed.
It really blurs the line between being a journalist and being an activist. And when you put it side by side like this, you can really see the heart of the critic's argument. On the left, you've got the Army's doctrine saying, yeah, use the media to get your message out. And on the right, you have the accusation that this is exactly what was happening in the real world, that a respected magazine was being used as a megaphone to amplify and legitimize Tip's narrative. Now we've got to pivot to maybe the most explosive part of the TIP simulations. This constant focus on what the US military might do in a contested election. This wasn't some side note. For many, this was the main event. To get a sense of where this idea came from, it helps to look at TIP's co-founder, Rosa Brooks. This timeline is pretty telling. Back in 2017, years before TIP even existed, she wrote an article for Foreign Policy where she literally games out the idea of a military coup. Fast forward to 2020, and that same exact theme is now a central part of the scenarios her new group is running. This idea didn't just appear out of thin air. And we have to remember, this wasn't happening in some fantasy world. These simulations were taking place while real-world tensions were sky-high. You had the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Mark Milley, reportedly on the phone with his counterpart in China, reassuring him that the U.S. government was stable. So the military's role wasn't just a hypothetical in a war game. It was a very live, very sensitive issue at the absolute highest levels of power. So as we start to land this plane, we've basically laid out two competing stories. You've got the official story from the Transition Integrity Project that this was all about protecting democracy. And then you have this other way of looking at it, using the U.S. Army's own playbook for influence operations. And when you do that, you can start to identify target audiences, lines of persuasion, and the media channels they use to spread their message. And that brings us to the final question, really the heart of the matter. Was the Transition Integrity Project just a war game, a responsible exercise to head off a crisis? Or was it something else? Was it a sophisticated mind game, a full-blown influence operation designed to shape how key people thought and acted during one of the most volatile political moments in recent memory? Based on everything we've looked at, that's a question you have to ask.